Okay, it's a little after 4, so we're going to get this study session started. And today we were talking about climate action plans as a part of our comprehensive plan update. So I will hand it over to Ms. Lust.
Thank you, Mayor Cole, and good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to say afternoon and not evening, so thanks for being here. As Mayor Cole said, today we are going to be discussing the climate element of the comprehensive plan. This is a new requirement for the cycle of comp plan updates is to have a climate element, and we'll dig into those details. But before we get started, I'll introduce Emma Johnson and Marty Snell, who are here with me. They are with WSP, our consultant team on the comprehensive plan update, and Emma is our climate element lead. So this presentation, we're going to go through background as to the requirements that led us to be here today working on the climate element, background and baseline data collection and analysis work done through an interlocal agreement with Clark County. And then we will move into talking through some first draft goals we are putting out there for y'all to react to and see if you have any ideas for additions, subtractions, changes, reframing. What do you think of when you think of climate policy in Ridgefield? So with that, I will turn it over to Emma to get us started.
Thank you. Now it's on? Great. Well, hi, everyone. As Claire mentioned, I'm Emma Johnson. I'm an environmental and land use planner with WSP. I'm working on a few of the climate elements for comprehensive plans in Southwest Washington. And just wanted to start off with some background on why we're doing this and the kind of regulatory requirements. So I'll go over the state requirements for climate planning, what is being done under an interlocal agreement with Clark County. And then also we recently had a survey out to the Ridgefield community to get hear from them about how they've been impacted by climate exacerbated hazards such as extreme heat. And then also to see if they have some ideas for policies or actions that they would like to see included. Next slide, please. So as Claire mentioned, this is now a required element under the Growth Management Act. So all comprehensive plans in Washington have to have a climate element. For cities above a certain size, which Ridgefield is, a greenhouse gas emissions reduction sub-element or sub-chapter is required. And that has to identify the actions Ridgefield will take to reduce overall GHG emissions, specifically those generated by transportation and land use, reduce per capita vehicle miles traveled or VMT, and it's also required that it prioritize reductions that benefit overburdened communities. And that's a state term, and it's referring to areas or groups of people who are currently experiencing the worst effects of these kinds of issues. So it could be areas that have worse air pollution compared to others, people with lower income who are having trouble paying their energy bills. It's saying, keep these people in mind when you're making your plans. The second requirement, and then this is for all cities in Washington, is a resilience sub-element. And that's focused on really improving Ridgefield's ability to prepare for and come back from a climate exacerbated hazard. And I'll get into kind of what those specifically are. But that element is required to equitably enhance resiliency to and avoid or substantially reduce the adverse impacts of climate change in human communities and ecological systems. And then similar to the GHG reduction sub-element, it should prioritize actions that benefit overburdened communities that will be most impacted by natural hazards. So I gave the example of people who are maybe having trouble paying their energy bills for GHG reduction. For people who are maybe overburdened by natural hazards, that might be someone who lives in a floodplain and is going to experience more flooding. Or people who live in older houses that are sometimes don't have great weatherization, and so they can be hit a little bit harder by storms or extreme heat. Next slide, please. So Ridgefield entered into an interlocal agreement that was put together by Clark County to do some cooperative climate planning. And the agreements between Clark County, Ridgefield, La Center, Camas, Battleground, Washougal, and Yacolt. And the key deliverables that were put together under that, it's pretty much wrapping up at this stage, but they did a GHG baseline inventory for Ridgefield, so it's Ridgefield specific, and that was, we'll get into the results of that in a minute, but quantifying what they think the GHG emissions are in Ridgefield, so that's the baseline to then create actions to reduce that. They provided staff training to city staff to update that inventory in the future. They provided an evaluation of current natural hazards in Ridgefield and then looked at projected changes. So, you know, how many days of extreme heat is Ridgefield going to experience in 2050 compared to today? Yeah.
Was Vancouver intentionally not invited to this, or were they like, we ain't doing this? Okay, thanks.
They are doing their own climate work.
Okay.
And then the other big deliverable that the county's consultant provided was a vulnerability and risk assessment, and that was looking at we talk in a minute about climate exacerbated hazards. Some of the findings that they found were that extreme heat is probably one of the worst hazards in Ridgefield in the future, and so the assessment looked at how that's probably going to affect wildlife in several water bodies in Ridgefield, as well as the wildlife refuge. And that was selected based on community and city input on what is a priority asset that we would want to make sure we're covering in the climate planning. Next slide, please. So I'll start off by mentioning I'm not the author of the GHG inventory. That was the county's consultant, but I will answer any questions that I can, and if you have one I can't, I will make sure to get that answer and get back to you. Kind of at the basic level, this graphic is showing what local emissions are in Ridgefield. And local refers to emissions that are being generated within the geographic boundary of the city. There's also something called imported emissions, and that's things that are occurring outside of Ridgefield but tied to the people living here. So a really common example would be airline travel. So the emissions are not here, but they are occurring because of people purchasing that. Another would be kind of goods production. So as you can see for the local emissions, and we kind of focus on local because those are the ones that the comprehensive plan could have the most impact on. Vast majority are building energy and transportation, and that's very common for the cities in Southwest Washington. Smaller amounts are coming from industrial process and product use and solid waste and wastewater. But really, building energy and transportation were where the majority were coming from, which is not surprising.
How do we gather data on that? Like, how do we know that those are, like, because we have some percentages here. So where are we tracking this, and how do we measure that?
So the county's consultant pulled from several different sources, and we can provide that full report out to you. But for buildings and energy in particular, they got that data from CPU directly, who provided quantities of their emissions, and then also how they've been calculating what they think the GHG value of those is.
Okay.
Next slide, please. So looking at kind of those two larger sources for building energy emissions, you'll see on the left, it's primarily electricity and natural gas. One thing that the GHG inventory author mentioned is Natural gas, sometimes electricity can be a bigger bang for your buck in terms of it takes more natural gas to, say, heat than it does electricity, and that has more emissions. So it's not, for residences that they're using 50% natural gas, it's just that it has high.
You suggested that it takes more natural gas than electricity?
And by emissions. That was
By
sort of
emissions?
clunkily worded. Natural gas just has more emissions, and so
If we're going to be dependent on electricity, how are we going to create that?
I wouldn't say you are going to be dependent on electricity. There was, I don't know if you want to comment on the state ruling that we not.
One of the questions that we actually asked was, when we're looking at emission loads for building energy emissions by source, one of the questions we asked and answered was, how do they get that, the percentages for electricity, natural gas, and otherwise. Natural gas, you see, is still there as a future energy source. It is still something that we will see as part of our emissions. But one of the things that the question was for electricity, you asked the question, well, where would it come from? And the reality is, and you know this from BPA, most of our electricity comes from hydro. However, there is the natural gas-fired generator at the Vancouver waterfront at their Lower River Road facility that adds into it, and then there are also their backup sources are also natural gas. When you're looking at emission loads, electricity, yes, we have a renewable resource that is the basic, that is the primary, but they do also have backup energy sources, and that percentage. Because I kind of, you look at it and the question for electricity is like, well, how is that such a high percentage of emissions when we're primarily hydro? Well, it's because of all of these other sources that electricity uses as well. But what you see is in other regions, in other grids, and using other power companies, that electricity is a much higher emission load than what we see here because of the hydro that we have. Is that fair to say, or? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, appreciate you jumping in. And then for transportation emissions, the figure on the left is excluding air travel, because as I mentioned, that's considered imported, and it's not something that the city necessarily has control over, but including it on the right, I think it's interesting to see what a large chunk of emissions are really coming from air travel. But the left is showing those local transportation emissions in Ridgefield, and as you can see, it's mostly from passenger cars. Off-road is referring to vehicles that are just not traveling on the standard roadways. A lot of times that's construction vehicles that are the off-road. Yeah.
I guess just to clarify on the air travel piece, so is that air travel purchased by people that live in Ridgefield, or is that just because of our proximity to PDX that it's kind of part of our?
I believe it's
deal?
based on purchase.
Okay. Okay.
Next slide, please. That was sort of all I had for the GHG inventory. We can certainly circle back to any questions on that, or we can send the report out later for you all to take a look at.
Council, one of the things that might be helpful for this, as I'm thinking through the questions you are asking about percentage, is, and then you would ask the question, Councilor Davis, about why. Is it because of where we are in the Portland metropolitan region, or is it just Ridgefield specific? One of the things that we should be able to get from the data from Clark County is relative to other jurisdictions in Clark County, and also relative to other jurisdictions in Washington with baseline GHG emissions. Where do we stand within that? Because we see it as percentages, but the question is like, okay, yes, air travel consists a relatively good share of emissions, of vehicle emissions, but maybe that just means we don't have as many vehicle emissions as some other areas do. I don't know the answer to that, but it's something we can certainly look into as how we relate to other jurisdictions. And I don't know if, Emma, if we have that information already. You're looking at your screen like you do.
Pulling it up. We do, so they did not do a comparison to each city, but we do have a comparison from Ridgefield to the state and globally, and the statewide per capita emissions are, I think it's 11.6, but it's 11 point something. Ridgefield is actually much lower. It's 5 point something, which is about the global average and is a pretty good indicator, and it's good news.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how to, because I find it to be interesting information, and I guess I'm trying to think about how it relates to like our growth planning. Because again, if we're saying that that's what is the types of emissions that's representative, like in our climate here close to us, and that's why I asked about the proximity to PDX. Like, okay, we got a major airport, we've got some other like recreational airports around. Okay, that makes some sense that that's part of our environment.
Right.
But in terms of that being emissions that are produced by people that live in Ridgefield, I'm not sure how our planning could impact that. And maybe it won't, and we just should be aware of it. I know.
Hold that thought, we're gonna get to that, the measures for how we might address.
And that's kind of why I was, anyway, pausing. All right.
It was also all just interesting chatting with Claudia, who was the author of this inventory, and she cautioned comparing yourselves too much to another city in Southwest Washington because it's not apples to apples, and really the baseline inventory, you're just trying to lower it from here. So I think, for example, Camas has a lot of industrial uses, and so that can kind of kick up their emissions there, but to what extent does the community want to say that those are their emissions? It's an industrial use that it could be emitting in Camas, it could be emitting somewhere else in the state. It's not like Camas owns that. The drive for those goods is coming from the global community.
The saying "we're better than Camas" is always fun. Sure. We still cook.
Turn your mic.
No, I didn't say it.
Oh, I found it. So global average is 4.3 per capita. State's 11.1 and Ridgefield is 5.0. All right, thank you. So I mentioned for the resilience sub-element that the purpose of that is to help prepare the Ridgefield community to respond to hazards in the future. And so there are 6 what they're called climate exacerbated hazards, and that is natural hazards that are expected to get worse over the next 50 to 100 years based on changes in the climate or hydrological conditions. So the first 3 of those, and for each of these you'll see those green triangles below, that is the data showing what the change is projected to be in Ridgefield in 2050 and by 2080. So extreme precipitation and extreme heat, those were the 2 that were marked as the highest risk for Ridgefield. And you can see how those are anticipated to increase over the next 100 years or so. Landslides, that's a funny one because we don't necessarily think of that as a climate hazard, but they're triggered by heavy precipitation, and so they're included in that. And you can see that those are also projected to become worse and more severe and more frequent in Ridgefield.
Question, please.
Yeah.
I'm looking at extreme heat. Is 40 days an average, or is that an exact count from what year?
It's I believe, increase of 40 days. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then is the second number an increase? Is the 2080 number added 62 days from the 2050 or 62 days from 2025?
I believe from 2025.
Okay.
And then the next slide is the remaining 3 hazards to consider when looking at improving resiliency in Ridgefield. Those are flooding, drought, and wildfires and smoke. And you can see red almost seems like it might be good news, but it's not. It's summer precipitation going down in the future. Wildfires and smoke, that the risk rating that I referred to is something that Clark County's came up with in the, what does CRESA stand for? Clark Emergency Services Agency. Yeah. Okay, thank you for the reminder. They came up with the risk ratings based on what they think is the likelihood as well as the severity of these, and they rated wildfires and smoke low. I would take that with a grain of salt, just especially given what we heard from the community that we'll get to later in the survey. That sounded like something people were very concerned about and felt that they had been impacted by recently. Next slide, please. So that community survey that ran from January 27th to February 10th for 2 weeks. We got almost 70 different responses. And the kind of purpose of the survey was, one, understand how Ridgefield has been affected in the past by natural hazards, those 6 specifically, understand how people responded in the past and what they think would help them respond even better in the future. And then the last was to identify some community-supported ideas for GHG emissions reduction. And that's kind of understanding that those can sometimes have negative ramifications if they're not crafted carefully. So getting people's ideas on ones that they would like, and then we also asked a question about whether they had any concerns about some of the ones that had been mentioned.
Do we plan to do more community engagement beyond, like more surveys beyond that? Because 67 is not really a high response, especially for comparison to other surveys we've done. Do we plan to do more of these to solicit feedback?
We hadn't planned for that in our schedule going forward, but if council wants to see it, we could try to fit it in.
Okay. I don't know yet.
So the first 2 questions were asking what people have been affected by, and as I mentioned, a lot of people brought up wildfire and wildfire smoke. They also highly mentioned items were severe storms and extreme heat and heat waves. Kind of how they were specifically impacted, the impacts that people most frequently mentioned were losing power or internet, disruption to transportation facilities such as a road closure or detour, and then having to miss work or school due to the hazard. When we asked whether they felt relatively prepared or well prepared, somewhat prepared, or not prepared or unsure, and about 2/3 of the community say that they feel well prepared to somewhat prepared, but about 1 in 3 were saying that they did not feel well prepared or were not sure about that. When listing what has helped them in the past respond to natural hazards, the 2 most common items were being prepared or a survival kit, emergency alerts, which are done through Clark. And then when asked what would help them for future, the 4 most common were community alerts, increased maintenance for roads and sidewalks, a community disaster preparedness plan, and access to disaster preparedness training or information.
Were those on the survey, were those pre-filled responses, or was that people putting those types of responses in there that you categorized?
We had pre-filled, and then there was always an other option.
Yeah. Okay.
As I mentioned in the state requirements, they want the elements to always keep in mind not exacerbating things for people who are already overburdened. And so we also asked the community, are there people, buildings, areas, or services that you feel are more vulnerable to natural hazards? And there was a very clear concern regarding elderly populations. In some cases, people mentioned specifically people who live alone or people who don't have internet and concerns about getting to them during natural hazards. The other two common ones were people with disabilities or medical conditions. And then 8 people also brought up nature and open space as something that they worry is vulnerable to hazards. I'll add, we did have one additional question in the survey that I didn't put up here because there wasn't a very clear consensus, but that was the one asking whether people had concerns about GHG reduction measures. I think 2 people answered the question directly. For the most part, everyone entered something, but it was generally reiterating the ideas that they had in the prior question. The 2 people who brought up concerns raised concerns about increased cost, particularly around energy. So I think we're about to dive into the goals and policies. Are there any questions about that work that I can answer?
Council, any questions? No, looks like we're ready to move on.
Great.
All right, thank you, Emma, for providing that context for our discussion here going forward, which is draft climate goals and policies. So as has been described, our team, as well as the county's team through our interlocal agreement, has put in quite a bit of work into figuring out where we are in relation to climate planning and climate impacts. And based on that input we've received so far, our team has put together some keyword draft climate planning goals and policies. So really the purpose of the rest of our time together is to go through those and get council's feedback and ideas on if we're on the right track, or if you want to see things be reframed, or if you have ideas for things that we have missed so far. So I'll go ahead and get started with the next slide. Just to provide a little more context here as far as physically drafting these goals and policies, the team at Commerce has provided quite a bit of guidance to local jurisdictions on how to frame some of these things. They suggest addressing this list of sectors across goals and policies. And I think relevant to our discussion today, we'll probably be going through a lot on buildings and energy, as has already been brought up. Transportation is a huge one. Emergency management was a major theme of a lot of the feedback received from the community, as well as economic development, particularly changing trends towards where people live and work. So as a note here, obviously the climate element is one of several elements in the comp plan, and it really, although technically needs to stand on its own to get us approved as meeting this requirement, it touches all the other elements. It's a very integrated topic, right? So to avoid too much duplication, we're going to rely on a lot of cross-referencing policies and other elements that are supportive of climate goals. So for example, policies in our land use, transportation, and economic development chapters that are aimed at decreasing vehicle miles traveled. In our land use chapter, encouraging walkable mixed-use neighborhoods, and kind of throughout as well, protecting natural resources. Next slide, please. This is just a recap, some sort of guiding questions for our discussion to keep in mind. Next slide. So we have drafted up a total of, 6 climate planning goals. And each of those goals, we've identified some potential policies that would support the goal. So the first goal is encourage buildings and utilities to be designed for energy efficiency and to withstand and recover from natural disasters. So this one's really about the resiliency of the built environment. There are 2 slides on this goal, so I don't know, maybe we'll go through the policies and then pause to discuss. Would that work for you? Okay, perfect. So the first draft policy, developer modified design standards to integrate building features that reduce the impacts of natural hazards and increase resilience. That's that weatherization goal. Promote the use of efficient energy systems in new and existing buildings. Prioritize weatherization of existing and new residential buildings to lower emissions and enhance resilience. Encourage local and community-based energy production and storage to provide education, economic development, and grid reliability benefits. Next slide, please. Develop or modify, sorry about that. Wrong side. Support the coordination of land use and multimodal, I'm sorry, I got mixed up.
There's the discussion items.
Okay.
Each one.
All right, sorry about that. Can you go back one, Julie? Thank you. All right, this is the only slide for goal 7.1. I apologize for that. So again, the overarching goal has to do with the built environment, encouraging buildings and utilities to be designed for energy efficiency with those 4 proposed policies. And yeah, I turn it back to you, Mayor, for any discussion on that topic.
Okay, council discussion pertaining to this particular goal. Any thoughts or questions on this?
Encourages such a, encourages is, I do here. Encourage is such a soft word, right? If we're gonna, I mean, is this something that we're gonna try to, are we going to put it in as rules, or is this just something that we are strictly just going to try to encourage?
That's a question for council on
Yeah.
this one for sure. Yeah.
I guess I think Emma might have mentioned this, but you know, it's how you message it a little bit too, because I think part of this has to be something that is, you know, you phrase it in a way that is well received by the community, right? I think that's kind of what you have to do. And so, you know, I went into that too, like we are using some soft language here. We're saying these are our goals and these are our policies around this, but are we approaching this as if, you know, this is part of our comp plan, but are we addressing this as if it's an actual climate crisis, or are we just saying this is like a climate mitigation plan? Like, how do we could be, like, is it stewardship, or is it a reaction to what we would consider a crisis kind of worldwide? And then if that's the case, you know, how do you message that?
So the first question you ask is truly a policy question. Mm-hmm. There are requirements under state law, and the requirements are to identify measures that reduce GHG emissions for your community, correct?
And increase resilience.
And increase resilience. So the question of what measures you believe help reduce it, the extent you are seeking reduction, the tracking associated with those specific reductions, and the measures you employ, there's a lot of latitude for local jurisdictions. And this is the first planning cycle that they have integrated this this element as a requirement. So I think there is softer language at the state level for this first planning cycle, and what I think you will see is that the language from the state will get, as we've seen with GMA most recently, more and more prescriptive. Mm-hmm. So I think this first go around, there is a lot of latitude for you as a council to decide the answer to your question, sir.
Well, I guess I'd be curious to know what everyone on council thinks about that. Like, how do we perceive this going into it?
Oh, sure. I'm speaking as a real layman here. But I think it makes sense to me as this is rolling out to keep the language softer. I think there's so many things that are happening growth-wise in the community. So part of the marketing strategy and part of the thing where we're saying, like, we're not all of a sudden like, bop, 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 here are these things that are happening feels, I think introducing the potential, and then I don't know if there are opportunities for incentives or for things to put things in place so that people are rewarded for or incentivized to do things. It makes sense to me. That's kind of where my initial thought went.
Yeah.
do we have a deadline that we have to meet to fulfill all these responsibilities?
Not aware of implementation tracking requirements under 1181, are you?
No. As mentioned, it's still a little nebulous at the state level. There is, I believe, going to be a requirement to update the GHG inventory in 5 years, but that's to see how you are tracking towards progress. It's not a requirement that you've hit a certain measure by then.
The only area that we have seen where they do have those types of, so there are tracking requirements that are starting to get built into GMA as part of our comp plan updates. So we are starting to have some requirements to at least track. But the first element that we are starting to see actual requirements on reductions is the housing element. And there's legislation that is going through the legislature right now that would require not only tracking, but requiring showing a reduction in the gap between inventory and need for more affordable housing. And that if you don't show that you are starting to close that gap, there are consequences that are being built in. So again, if you look at this as a new requirement, housing's been around a while, you could see that very easily be the next step.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I've kind of wrestled with some of the language too, because like you said, it's really kind of loose, you know? And, you know, for both of the elements, I kind of say, compared to what? Like energy efficient compared to what? Mm-hmm. Like what we do now? Like, are we saying we have to accelerate, withstand and recover from natural disasters? Like compared to what? And I think there's also that cost element where if we were to tighten it up, you know, you might end up boxing yourself into policy that commits you to creating requirements that, you know, from a cost-benefit analysis don't necessarily square. But if we've, you know, said we want to do that. However, like if we are going to be more, I hesitate to use the word aggressive, but be a little more firm in what our goals are, this is probably one to do it. Like, I mean, who can argue with saying we should probably, you know, figure out how to be more energy efficient and make it so that our structures can survive a natural disaster a little bit better. But I don't know exactly how you do that. And without being able to say that, I wouldn't want to firm up that language.
Well, I guess I look at that and I also consider how much, like how do we prioritize this? Like what are those factors? Like, you know, we've heard cost floated several times already. So is this going to make the cost of housing go up? Is this going to drive up the cost to families who live in the area? Is that the primary consideration we should have? Or is it, you know, again, I go back to stewardship, because if you're saying this is something that we're doing because we're required to do, yes, but we're also doing it because there's maybe an inherent need to do this, you know, making homes more energy efficient or recoverable against natural disasters, then is cost the primary consideration there, or is there another factor that should be above that?
So is it beneficial, because there are not metrics that we're beholden to at this point, is it beneficial to start the language somewhere and then we can adapt that to further restrictions in the future? Is it better to start somewhere and then move in that direction?
Like
or do you
ratchet? Are you saying ratchet up like the
like
required?
keep the language softer
Yeah.
to begin with, and then we say in 5 years, once that policy's sort of been digested somewhat by the public, then we say, okay, now this moving forward is the way that we're going to implement this plan further.
That is certainly an option. You know, I think that, again, that gets to the policy implementation of this. So that is certainly an option that you can consider.
Okay. Mr. Wells.
Yeah. My comment is, I got a hoarse throat today. My comment is to soft pedal to start off with, so we can increase it as we get going. Right. One of the problems that I face, or I see a lot of things, and one of them is our wind loads. This is talking about regulation. Wind loads, any buildings we put up, we got to put up for 135 mile an hour winds. North County does not get 135 mile an hour. Along the gorge, we do. it's accepted countywide, it's 135 miles an hour. So that regulation adds to costs for commercial buildings or whatever. So that's why we need to be careful of what we do, because if we agree to something, it may be an overkill, I guess, is my comment. So that's it. Thank you.
Well, so going back to the GHG inventory, and there was some estimates in there about, increases, like in, over time. And are there things we can do, like if we implement a policy now and then we say, okay, in 2030 we're gonna check in on this, are we able to see what kind of progress we're making against maybe that 20-year outlook and say, like, we're on pace for this and now we're on pace for a lower factor there?
Yes, we'll be going through another comp plan update in 10 years, and that's exactly the purpose of it, is to look at past goals and policies and implementation strategies implemented now, and check in. And part of this as well, this is policy level. We'll have implementation items for all of these, including tracking. So what this might look like in a final comprehensive plan document or documents or website or whatever it looks like is, okay, policy 7.1.2, promote the use of efficient energy systems in new and existing buildings. Okay, we come up with a way to track that, and then an implementation item is, create a 5-year or 10-year report to identify a new baseline,
right?
Kind of thing.
Well, and I was thinking too about, the stormwater policy that we just put in place that's going to come into effect in the next couple of years, and the the requirements that's going to hit our community with, the dollars that's going to cost. That's already a pretty big hit for the city. It's coming down the road here in a couple of years, and so it would be good to go soft with this at first, for sure.
Councilor Hamilton.
Thank you. Just for my own clarification here, I'm sorry if this is a question people already know. So is this a 10-year decision we're making right now? Because we're going to reevaluate the comp plan in another 10 years? So it's like we're doing this and this is a solid 10. It's not like in 5 we'll look at the data, but we're really not realistically making another change for another 10 years?
Well, so real quick, I think that is a policy question, though, because what I was going to say as well is, yes, we're required to look at this in 10 years, but I guess maybe for this council, maybe we want to decide, is 10 years too far out, or do we want to build in our own checkpoints sooner than that, like 3 to 5 years, and say, how are we tracking on this? Because if we're talking about starting with softer language up front and then ratcheting it up, do we want to hold this body accountable to checking in on that and then making modifications, more incremental modifications?
I would agree. I think that since we really don't know what we're trying to do, it would be wise to implement whatever right now, but look at it on a reoccurring basis. How are we doing? Is this working? Is this not working? Do we need to change this?
Legally, you have that ability to do so. What the Growth Management Act says is that comprehensive plans shall be reviewed and revised as necessary every 9 years, 10 years, but you can do it more frequently, so as necessary. So what they don't want to see is you coming back to your comp plan every year and changing a bunch of things, because the whole idea is this is a long-term plan. It's a long-range plan, and you don't want to adjust course frequently. Otherwise, you're not planning, you're reacting. But for the purposes of can you make course corrections along the path? Absolutely.
Okay. I'd be supportive of that. I don't know if there's a recommended interval. Like, again, I understand that we don't want to constantly be moving the goalpost, but I do want to measure it. I want to make sure that one thing about this whole comp plan process that I've been interested in is not just checking the box and getting something that the state will sign off on, the county will sign off on, but do something that's going to formulate meaningful policy for Ridgefield. And we don't know if we're going to do that. I think 10 years is too long to do that. So we'll go to you. Yeah.
It's not uncommon to see a 5-year check-in.
Okay.
Because these plan updates do take a while, especially if you engage the community. It's a year and a half, and then that's just something for the council to think about.
Gotcha. Somebody else had a question, I think. Okay. Last question on this, and this is for you, Ms. Les. These seem like pretty standard policies, and so I think it's good. I guess my question is, do we have policies like this already in place, or is this completely new for us?
Climate element is completely new for us.
Okay.
We have policies in our existing comp plan that are sort of naturally related to climate, but not these. It's more things that are tangentially related, like multimodal transportation, environmental protection, et cetera.
Okay.
So these are new.
Mr. Davis.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at the discussion item piece that we hadn't really touched on, and I believe Vancouver did something similar not long ago. I would be interested in having a conversation, because I think there's a lot of elements associated with a program like that. But I think that would be a worthy thing for us to walk down the path of eventually. Providing some sort of possible incentive to people that are making upgrades that make their homes more energy efficient. Yeah, I don't think it's something we got to hash out now. I think we definitely need the data, but I think it'd be a worthy question for us to look at.
One of the things that I noticed that was not tracked within the whatever GH was food waste. Because in most communities, food waste makes up 50% of that. So why was that not tracked on here? Do we know why?
I don't, but I can get that answer for you.
Okay, are we ready to move on? Okay, let's go.
Move on to the next topic here. So the second draft goal has to do with multimodal transportation, improve the efficiency and resiliency of the local multimodal transportation system. And some topics we have as a draft broken this down into our first, integration and coordination of land use and multimodal transportation planning. Second has to do with public vehicles and our fleet as the city. Third has to do with electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. Fourth, street connectivity and walkability in general, and thinking about evacuation routes when it comes to those climate hazards. And then fifth, identifying transportation infrastructure that is vulnerable to natural hazards and planning for resiliency of that infrastructure. Those are the policy topics we propose at this point around this goal of improving multimodal transportation resiliency to serve climate planning goals.
Councilor Wells.
The comment I got is let's move on to the next goal because we're covering all of those. No.
On these?
Yeah, all the way through from 721 to 722, 723. We're already implemented and moving.
Very true. A lot of these things are, our current practices kind of really enhancing those, calling them out as what we do. I think the potential action item was at the bottom of this one of, do you want it to put anything more specific in there, like adding shade to bus stops or popular active transit corridors? Obviously increasing your tree canopy actually creates a carbon sink. It also decreases the heat island effect that you get in those kind of higher density areas.
We've floated the idea of incentives a couple of times. Do we attach incentives as like components to policy, each of these policies, or like is there a separate place where we would identify those types of things?
So on the policy level, it could be something along the lines of incentivize XYZ or incentivize XYZ type of thing. And then the step nested below that would be to identify, specific programs. Short answer, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. As has been mentioned, we have a lot of latitude here. So, yeah. And because we don't have a climate element now, a lot of this is stuff that, we can pat ourselves on the back. We're already working on, but this is a way to solidify it and say, yes, this is still a priority going forward.
Okay. Other questions or thoughts on this one, council? Mm-hmm.
Just thoughts, I think that adding shade or bus stops to popular, I think that's a good idea in general.
What'd you say the first part?
The potential action item on the bottom, I'm supportive of that, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
This might be an inappropriate comment, but I do not want an electric fire engine showing up to my house if my house is on fire.
I think that's fair. Yeah. I'm not exactly sure why yet, but it sounds like it sounds like it could be fair. I am interested in incentives around this. I know we've covered a lot of this, but I would be interested in exploring some incentives around this to encourage, like if we are doing our part to create, like say, walkable neighborhoods, like multimodal transportation networks, then we should incentivize people to use them, because I think I think just as Americans, that's just kind of like hasn't been part of our DNA. Like we've always been so spread out. We always take the car everywhere. We built our entire communities around vehicle traffic. So looking at ways we can do that, and the first thing comes to mind is we've talked about golf carts in this community. Is there benefit to that, to incentivizing? Maybe this becomes a golf cart community or something like that, or the use of trails or things like that, walkable neighborhoods. If you do that, so that might be something I'd like to explore.
Aren't we already working diligently on walkable neighborhoods and trails and things? I do like the idea of possibly allowing golf carts in more areas of the city.
That would be fun, yeah.
That's certainly something that we can integrate into this.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, that's it. I'm good.
All right, we can move on to the next topic then. Draft goal 7.3. This is a pretty classic topic. Thinking about our climate and resilience and greenhouse gas reduction. It's protect and restore green spaces and habitat to be resilient to natural hazards, and provide refuge for people and wildlife during extreme weather. So this is really on the resiliency of us and our open spaces. So we'll go through the list here. Number 1 is implementing actions identified in stream restoration and salmon recovery plans in our watersheds. Coordinate with our environmental agencies on adaptive management strategies, particularly for the wildlife refuge. Identify opportunities to expand habitat protection and improve habitat quality as well as connectivity. And that has a potential action item for discussion. Protect and restore wetlands and wetland corridors to, again, provide that hydrological connectivity that fosters resistance to flood risk and extreme weather events. And then as the last item proposed here, protect and expand public green spaces and tree canopy to be resilient to extreme weather events and natural hazards.
Council, any discussion points on this one?
Yeah. I'm not, maybe I'm just missing it, but I'm not seeing how we point to the last part of the main goal, which is providing refuge for people and wildlife during extreme weather. Because I was trying to figure out what sort of policy could address that, and I don't see that nested into any of those 5. I see a lot of it being protecting, restoring green space, and being and habitat to be resilient to natural hazards. But in terms of providing a refuge, I'm thinking about, isn't that saying if there's extreme heat, providing some sort of place for people and animals to be able to go to get some shade or, I mean, so is it opening up public facilities in those types of cases or working with the school district or whatever? I just don't see it nested in any of the actual 5 policies.
So the easy way to think about that is, where do you go when you're hot? You go to the water.
Yeah.
Right? So every one of those measures that talks about stream restoration, protection, watershed, refuge, all of those are places you go when you're hot. So that's what when they're talking about like provide refuge for people and wildlife during extreme weather, it's like, well, where are they going to go? They're going to go where they can actually get cool. So you have to provide for protection of those areas that provide refuge when you're hot.
But it's also, I mean, that heat, that addresses the heat, but what about extreme weather? That could be, smoke from wildfires. It could be, flooding.
Great point.
In which you don't want to be by the water.
So as far as the extreme weather, that's something we can definitely look to add to that. That's a great point as far as other types of extreme weather events.
And there are going to be a couple goals on slides coming up that are more specific to that emergency response and community health side of it.
Other comments or questions on this one, council? I think there, from my standpoint, there could be. I think that this is one of those that, kind of what you're saying, like, well, how do you? I just think about the green space and how you protect that. Number one, are we already doing that? And then number two, what does that actually look like? I guess I start questioning that. Not necessarily a question with an answer. I mean, if you have an answer, that's great. But.
No, I don't. I was, any more clarity on that would be good, or questions that you want us to look at, or ideas for, go ahead.
I was just going to say, maybe if we do have some of those additional measures in the other goals, maybe we go through that, see if it is touching on some of that. If not, maybe that'll help provide clarity on what we might want to amend.
Yeah, or maybe that's just a component of the overall goal that we feel comfortable pulling out of that specific goal because it's maybe addressed as a byproduct of another goal or something like that.
Yeah, we can always change the language to make it more clear what goes where, I think.
It's just my teacher brain.
Yeah.
Great on a rubric.
Also, the term tree canopy is interesting because we plant a lot of individual trees, but we don't really plant tree canopies. And one of Morgan, one of the people that comes and talks often to the council, has mentioned tree canopies a couple times, and I was thinking about that, and I thought perhaps in some of our parks or areas, it would be possible to plant some of the trees closer together to create more of a tree canopy in areas than just individual trees in places. I don't know, something we could think about.
Okay, I think we can move on.
Move on, great. Oh, sorry, Julie, can you go one more? One forward? One more? 7.4, yeah, perfect, thank you. All right, so fourth topic here, potential goal, is protecting the long-term sustainability of the municipal water system, specifically from impacts of development and changing hydrological conditions. And this is a topic that is definitely something we've been discussing of late. I know Mr. Green and our audience of two has spent a lot of time looking at this, so this is a goal that would be very much integrated with our water plan. That, of course, is being concurrently worked on.
Would this be building in seasonal water conservation efforts, to manage our water usage? So we've done that in the last couple of summers where we talked about that, but would this be sort of codifying that to some degree?
Certainly could.
And then also, what about the pursuing say new water rights, or expanding our water, our access to water supply. I know that's something we already do, but is that something that we need to more aggressively look at and incorporate into this plan?
Yeah, I mean, not to beat the drum, but that is a policy question.
Yeah.
And I know that's part of our water system plan. But in terms of strengthening a stance there, if it, the more cross-referenced or integrated or redundant those two documents are, I think
Right.
there's something there.
Let me clarify my question. So yeah, I understand it's a policy question, and I guess what I'm saying and asking that is, I think we need to. The question is, do we put that here? Is this where this belongs, or does it belong someplace else? Is that through like ordinance or what? Like, or is this the most appropriate spot to address that?
I'm not sure.
I think that's something we'd have to get back to you on.
So your city manager and mayor pushed very hard to get funding for the Kennedy Well project while we were in DC the last 3 days. So, well, I didn't say too much about that part, but so, if we get any money from the government this year, maybe we will actually achieve that.
I guess I just also, like, is there, like, council, do we attach metrics to this, right? Like, we need to expand our water supply by X over Y amount of time.
That is something that actually would exist as part of the water system plan update.
Okay.
Yeah, that would live in there. These are a little more general because these are planning policies. So the measures you're speaking to are things that we would be addressing as part of the water system plan updates that we do.
Great. Okay, I'm good with that.
Yeah, next slide, please. Okay. We can go back to that if you'd like, yeah.
My question for Director Lust was on the discussion item of whether the city should encourage or facilitate those actions on private properties with kind of permit fee reductions or otherwise. The conversation about water conservation, reclaimed water systems, smart irrigation, we've had some conversation about that with council about whether we should start working toward more incentive, working to incentivize HOAs, subdivisions, and individual property owners to lower overall water usage. And is that something that we want to kind of integrate that as a philosophy or policy within this?
Council, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I know the HOA I live in, they require you to have a green yard. Well, grass naturally hibernates in the summer. I think there should be the ability of the city to go to the HOAs and say, due to this, we are requesting you not irrigate lawns.
Also, for people also that live in a neighborhood that requires green grass, there's eco-friendly green grass spray paint that you can put in your yard. That way you don't have to water it and the grass remains. If you need any information, I'd be happy to help you.
I think that a lot of our incentivization was addressed maybe, a year or so ago when, like, redoing the water rates and creating that new tier where people that were really low were going to save some money and just sort of rebalancing things. So I think that there's already been some good work on that. As far as, like, the implementation of new systems, I wouldn't mind, entertaining or, looking at the numbers for the waiving or reducing permit fees. If somebody's going to implement, a system that could have positive benefit but costs more money, which usually that's how it works, and incentivizing that, especially as, we just come off the heels of, having that cost recovery conversation. And if we're going to get full cost recovery, that kind of opens the door for us to be strategic in what we are willing to incentivize.
Councilor Hamilton.
I don't know if this is applicable, but is there a method in which we, with so much residential development coming forward, that we're incentivizing builders and or like the Lennars of the world or whomever that are like, that they integrate those programs from the start in these neighborhoods, and then that moving forward, they get some kind of reward for having smarter lawn care systems?
Not really, not yet. I mean, it really hasn't been integrated. It's not something that council has done. And as far as the, certainly rate structures have been addressed, but we will be bringing more incentivized measures and potentially not just incentivized measures, but requirements and restrictions with water use as we look at the, our water usage and water system over the next couple of years as we're moving toward Kennedy Well and our East Side Reservoir. So, but to your question, no, it has not been something that has made its way to code. The way this generally works is this is policy level and it's a 20-year plan, and then this will set your general policy guidelines. We then will start working within that framework to create implementation strategies, which will work their way through into code. So in those code pieces, we'll come to you and then we'll have the question of, well, you have a policy that says provide these incentives for new systems. Would you like to look at some code to implement that?
Yeah. And I think I'd be interested in that. Like, I was just thinking about like going back to even how I think it was one of the first goals, talking about more sustainable buildings, and I think about in the summertime around here, I know with my irrigation system at home, it is probably not the most conservation friendly. I have to manage it, otherwise my water bill goes up to like $500 or something. So, but is there things that we can incorporate there to say we require, like, I don't know that if builders have really thought too in depth about that, like when they build in an irrigation system in a new home, is there something we can say that would require like more eco-friendly, or more efficient irrigation systems already built in there? I don't know if that's something that exists or not, but that's something I think I'd be interested in looking at as well.
Yeah, I'll note too, bouncing off of what Mr. Stewart said, the implementation of this kind of comes from two directions, right? We would have these policies in place, and then a next step would be to draft implementing code and bring that through council. The other way that these come up over time is, say 5 years from now, we get approached by builders saying, hey, in this city, they're doing this type of incentive. Would you consider that? We can look backwards at our policies and say, yeah, that could fit with our comp plan. Let's bring it through council.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say if there's opportunities to do that, then do so. But so what I'm hearing you also say that these policies are less prescriptive, but they're more broad strokes, and then we go with the fine tune it with code.
Exactly.
Okay.
Are we ready for the next slide here?
Let's
All right.
roll.
Perfect. So these last two topics are going to get more at the emergency preparedness and response side of things. So proposed goal number 5 here is enhanced emergency preparedness, response, and recovery efforts to mitigate risks and impacts associated with extreme weather and other hazards. So some topics within that: developing comprehensive and accessible evacuation plans and other educational materials and alerts, collaborating with CRESA, as we already do, on readiness, conduct pre-disaster assessments for critical and essential facilities to create strategies to mitigate risks, encourage, there's your favorite word again, local businesses to develop and implement comprehensive emergency preparedness and response plans to minimize disruption. So this is emergency preparedness response both as a city and in collaboration with our community.
So when we say collaborating with CRESA, what I would like to see in this is there's two different things. So I'm on the ECHO board for ending community homelessness, and Council for the Homeless sends out their own alerts, and those are for weather advisory, like extreme weather. And then the alerts that CRESA sends out is like everyone, it doesn't matter if you're in a house or not, you will be impacted by this. But I think if we're going to look at CRESA, that we should also include looking at the other weather alerts that we get for heat and extreme cold or something else coming in that would impact those who are more vulnerable in our community. That way we reach a broader network of people in our community, not just in extremes. Do we have more?
There's one more. Once we go through these are ones for you to react to that we've already put together, and then we expect further discussion on things we haven't even thought of yet. So thank you.
Okay, so council, any other thoughts on emergency preparedness and response? I think, okay, we can move forward with the last one.
All right, Julie, can you click that once more forward so we get the notes? Perfect. So this last one is very much related to the last one, but specifically focused on vulnerable residents and overburdened communities. As we went through at the start of this presentation, that is an objective of climate planning, is to consider disparate impacts on overburdened communities. So protect community health and well-being from the impacts of climate-exacerbated hazards and ensure that the most vulnerable residents and overburdened communities do not bear disproportionate health impacts. And then 2 items on the screen there with some discussion items as well to maybe spark some conversation.
Can we start by maybe defining what vulnerable residents and overburdened communities are in relation to, say, climate policy?
Yeah, they're defined in the Revised Code of Washington. Kind of at the basic level, overburdened community is referring to the geographic area. So like this area is more prone to flood hazards. That is the overburdened community. And then vulnerable populations are kind of the individuals or households, wherever they may be, that could be more affected. People with low income, people who don't speak English as their first language and might not get the alerts. Those are the examples.
Could that even be like homes that may not be, I guess, either energy efficient or I think about during extreme heat, right? Like a lot of houses in this area, especially older homes, don't have air conditioning. Is that kind of what we talk about too in practical terms?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think when we talk, the question for what existing locations in the city could serve as a designated refuge during events is looking at what places do we have in Ridgefield, if any, that are ran on generator or that have that ability if there's a major power outage, because I'm thinking of the residents that you could use generator to go and recharge a battery so you can go back home and run off of that, or parents with infants that don't nurse and they need to heat their bottles up, and if there's no power they can't have hot water, so how do we mitigate that out? And then I think of my neighbor across the street. She has a daughter who's pretty significantly impacted by her disability in an electric wheelchair, and they rely on that stuff. So seeing somewhere in the city that has the bandwidth on generator that residents can go and either stay if needed or recharge so that they can go back home and kind of go about their business and wait for the storm to be over.
Very good point, Katie.
Yeah. In terms of like the resilience hub, like physical locations, I'm thinking of, I think for downtown, we're sitting in it, I think that this facility would probably be what we would define. Outside of the downtown area, that's where I think it gets sticky. I guess my question is, from a policy perspective, are we able to designate like school facilities? Those aren't technically ours. We have a partnership with the school district, but I would imagine something happens on Hillhurst, it's probably one of the 2 large schools. Something happens on the east side. I don't even know what our answer would be right now, but maybe, hopefully the new elementary school in a year or whatever.
Or Clark College.
Or Clark College. Yeah, and even where I'm at in Pioneer Canyon, I don't know exactly what it would be. Maybe this would still be determined to be the closest. But I guess, do they have to be city-owned facilities, or can we rely on partners?
Could certainly have at both the policy and implementation levels language about, interagency agreements for exactly that type of thing.
And do we have generators?
Not yet is the quick answer. We have small scale generators. We have several small scale generators that will certainly do provide some assistance. But as far as larger generators that would assure resiliency, we do not. One of the things that we looked at in the energy update that we did with, what was the name of the company that we worked with? Willdan. So Willdan did kind of an energy audit to look at what are the kind of energy upgrades that we might be able to do to city facilities. One of the top tier facility updates and upgrades would be to provide generators, large scale generators at Public Works Ops, because one of those locations, when we're thinking about resiliency in whether it be severe weather events or whether it be natural disasters, is at Public Works Operations. And so we want to make sure that we actually have the ability to, if the grid goes down, still be able to have that facility be operational. So we are looking at investing in a large generator and storage capacity for renewable energy and solar for the roof at Public Works Operations. At the TMI building down?
Just a comment. We can have all the generators we need, but we do not have any capacity to store fuel to run those generators. So if we had a disaster, we are responsible and need to go to the local fueling stations. If they're not functioning, we're in trouble. So I think we also need to look at the potential to have fuel storage in the event of a disaster to run the generators.
Going back to the partnerships for shelter in place, one of the things that I've learned in the Greater Vancouver area when they do shelter in place or having shelters for severe weather for our homeless population is that we have to be really strategic with those, because we also need the people to make sure they can get to those places to open them up and have access. So having many different pockets in the area to make sure like they're accessible, not only just for the residents, but for whoever the volunteers are to actually get there and run those shelters, because you can create a partnership with the school, but if the school's like, you can't get in here unless we're here, and then nobody can come, it's a moot point.
That never happened.
Yeah, one thing I was going to point out too, because Councilor Burker's comment about the fuel raised a good point. And one thing I would put out there as a possible solution that kind of opens up a whole other door is, utilizing solar, because that doesn't take as much from a storage perspective. And I believe they have technology to be able to store solar energy as opposed to like a fuel tank, but I'm sure that there's a cost piece too. So I don't know if that's an avenue we'd want to go down, or if it's even appropriate for this level of the conversation or not.
I think that could make sense as a GHG reduction policy in here.
Yeah, and we actually had something in there about solar and, incentivizing solar projects, community solar projects within one of the other goals. So yes, at a policy level, and then again, once we get to implementation level, and I love that you guys are already going to that level of implementation, but just as a reminder, this is top line policy. This is not implementation strategies. Those strategies of storage and how do we do it and where do we do it, those will be conversations we have to have, and that you will ultimately decide, just not in this.
So then you'll not like my comment, because what actions are needed to ensure we reach vulnerable members of the community sounds more like how do we do it versus policy. So we need to be able to identify or have some sort of hub or directory of communities that have identified themselves as a vulnerable population.
So back that up. How do you get there? So it's because you're getting to the answer, and the answer becomes the implementation. The policy is you're going from goal to answer. And in between that is policy. And the policy says, okay, if the goal is at this level to ensure, protect community health and well-being and ensure that the most vulnerable, then take it one level of abstraction down, not to the answer. So somewhere in between that is like, because what you're saying makes perfect sense. Okay, how do we take it up one level of abstraction so you're not putting an implementation strategy as a goal?
Right, so, I don't know if this is in between, but this is kind of where my head's at, and feel free to help me out with it. But, you know, I look at that discussion item, right? What actions are needed? And I think that when I look at something like this, it naturally goes to, here we are, the local government's responsibility is X, Y, and Z of this, right? And I think that we are sort of the hub of that by creating policy around that. But I don't necessarily think it falls entirely on a local government or a regional government to implement this. This is a community-wide effort. So I think that we see this as community partnerships, right? Partnering with, you know, schools, partnering with churches, partnering with our other organizations to do that. And I think that's where we insert that in here and say, like we stated, like, you know, broadly, it has to be a community-wide effort. Otherwise, it won't work, because if you had an extreme situation, you'll fail unless if everyone in this town is looking to little old city of Ridgefield government. Who else had something?
I was just going to mention that, you know, creating partnerships with your school district and our college, any other non-government agencies or even churches.
Yeah, so that, I guess, if I'd go so far as even say, like, do we include that? Like, do we include that here, some language along the, yeah.
Wonderful. All right, shall we open it up to just additional discussion on the policy level here? Before we get to next steps, just anyone else have notes and feedback to share?
So before we get to Councilor Favella's multi-page list, how are we on time? Is this something, because I know we have another item on the agenda tonight. I think it's going to not be as long as this, but like, how are we approaching this?
The item that I need to cover with you for EMS District 2 board will take like 10 minutes.
Okay.
So we have plenty of time. So
we can, okay. And the goal is to hard stop at 6 p.m. or are we just going to go until we feel like we're ready?
We didn't identify it as a hard stop at 6, but I also kind of promised you guys that I wouldn't hold you until after 6, so I also don't want to like go back on my word the first time we do this. I want to kind of like ease into that. So.
Okay, we have hard stops, so yeah, we'll move efficiently. Okay, let's move ahead then.
Okay, so I kind of nerded out last night, and I looked at what some other cities do in their plans and how it could be maybe implemented in Ridgefield. One of them that really stood out to me is almost counterproductive to our comprehensive growth plan, where we look at growing within Ridgefield, but it's preserving a minimum of 100,000 acres of farmland for agriculture by rezoning some of that rural to agriculture land. And then revising some land use and development codes based on current and projected climate impacts to reduce damage and enhance resilience within the natural areas.
Walk through the second part of it again. Can you say that second part? The first part's a county function. We don't actually do anything with agriculturally zoned properties, but go to what was the second part?
Revising land use and development codes based on current and projected, so that what we were looking at, projected climate impacts to reduce damage and enhance resilience. So when we talk about landslides or flooding, or is there anything that in any of those codes that we can go back and kind of revise and look at to make sure those codes for building out in the future match kind of this direction that is projected with the climate change?
Basically an inventory of our existing codes to determine how they would affect resiliency. Yeah, that absolutely could be a strategy. Yes.
Yeah, a code audit, basically.
Yeah, a code
would be
audit.
A really good action strategy, yeah.
Yeah, I guess when you say it that way, I can get behind that. When we start looking at like, preserving land or whatever, I think that the county council already has done that work for us because they're basically saying we can't. But more than that, and this, that was my dig, because. But also like I think there's an inherent tension in that, right? Because like we talk about preserving lands or like having green spaces and stuff, but at the same time, this whole point is how do we effectively manage growth? Because as a city, our job is within our city limits is to grow, to develop our buildable vacant land. So like I'm just where's the middle ground there?
There's not. There is an inherent tension in this entire Growth Management Act. It has always been the case. Like the Growth Management Act is a built-in tension. There are now 14 goals plus the Shoreline Management Act. And if you looked at them and put them side by side, they compete with one another.
They do.
Some of them are absolutely, you would look and you would say, well, that's opposed to that. There is an inherent tension in all those goals, but that's the joy and the struggle of growth management, and how you help us develop this community is understanding the tension between those, and then how do you manage that tension? How do you try to navigate it? So you're right, there are inherent tensions built in. That's just the Growth Management Act, and it's just the reality of how we grow. There are always going to be those tensions.
Okay. Other thoughts on this, on that one, or do we want to move? Do you have other items?
Yeah, I have two more.
Just two?
Yeah, just two. The other one is irrelevant to anything because it wasn't even brought up, but was the food waste, and this is in my dream world. So food waste has the greatest impact on the solid waste emissions from landfills. So if there was a way that we could have like community composting centers that would feed a community garden that could then turn around and give back to our Saturday market, like it would just be at all community things. So I know we're not talking about the plans or how we're going to implement that, but that makes a huge difference. When you are recycling and there's food in those recycling containers, that cannot be reused as intended. It goes to the landfill. So if we can find a way to reduce some of that food, and it sounds like it's not even being looked at, so maybe we'll get the gold star for kind of moving in that direction before it's even brought up on the map.
So the state, excellent point. It is something that, and you know that I serve on the statewide Comprehensive Climate Action Plan Advisory Committee in the state of Washington right now. And we're going through the climate action plan for the state right now. And we had a whole session talking about solid waste and its contribution to GHG emissions and strategies to reduce. So there are examples out there, and certainly we can pull some stuff together that is actually being discussed, at least at the state level. But you're right, it's not something that gets discussed a lot at the local level because of the primacy of what we see here, which is transportation and building envelope, which are kind of the two big ticket items that we see as far as emissions. But with regards to how we might contribute on that side of it, yeah, we can get some information on that and bring it back to you all to look at.
That was one of the things I had written down too, yeah, I did two parts right here. Consumption and disposal, and then divert waste from landfills. And so which goal would that probably fit under best?
It might be a new one, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can add that. We can have as many as we want, but.
Well, we already do our cleanup days. So, you know what sorry, we already do our city cleanup, so that's great, but, that could probably fall under a new subsection, if you will, of that waste and waste reduction.
Yeah, and you can kind of see the path there from a policy of waste reduction to a strategy of a lot of the things you talked about. Oh, yeah.
Okay, the last two things are expanding the canopy coverage. So not just around finding ways to expand that, but also in new developments, we put up in our HOAs like these little tiny trees that are cute to look at, but they don't do anything. And when you would think of tree canopy coverage, this is great in like hot weather. It prevents the sun from baking down on exposed houses, which can then in turn reduce the amount of energy that you're using to cool that house. And it also kind of protects you from the elements, so much snowfall not on your house. So I would really like to look at that. And then, you know, maybe this is something we're not supposed to talk about right now, but encouraging builders in Ridgefield specifically to reduce the material waste by reusing some of those materials on houses, so that we're not throwing things away or adding to that waste. And maybe that can be in our subsection on waste reduction. Yeah.
I think we should add an additional goal under waste reduction.
Sounds good.
Are there any ways without some astronomical cost to make our streetlights in neighborhoods like a solar component to it? So if power did go out, we still have some lighting in the dark?
Don't know. It's something we could look into. We went through the transition to LED lighting not that long ago and worked with Clark Public Utilities. They had a grant program at the time, and so that we transitioned all of our old street lights, got transitioned to LEDs so that they were energy efficient. For the purposes of resiliency and having a solar component to it, it's certainly something we can look at. I would say it's likely, yes, we can look at. It's probably not. It's probably more of an implementation strategy, but part of, you know, looking at community solar and those types of aspects, it would be an implementation strategy associated with. But we can absolutely look into it as a separate item. We can do that.
Okay, council, other thoughts or that maybe that weren't discussed or you would like to revisit on any of the goals we've seen so far tonight? Ms. Les, what's our next touch on this? Where do we go from here?
Well, our next work is going to be basically updating this draft of goals and policies based on what we heard this afternoon. I think that additional goal related to waste is the biggest change, but certainly we've heard some other things that could be tweaked and reframed within. Then, yeah, we'll have to figure out what the next touch is, if it's another session like this, or if it's like a presentation during a meeting. Ultimately, we need to adopt a climate element really by July 1st, because that's when our grant funding runs out and we want to get it back. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's an incentive. Yeah.
Yes,
For the whole comp plan or just this?
Both. But right now we are focused on the money we have earmarked for the climate planning grant from Commerce, which is a large chunk of change, and it is very feasible for us to get it all. So
of course.
That's the goal. The periodic update grant, we don't need to talk about.
Okay. Okay.
So we will figure out next steps for you, but expect a couple more touches on this, and then ultimately adoption of the element by June 30th.
Yeah. And I go back to what I said at the beginning. My interest in this is, yes, maintaining that, because I think other people should pay for it, so, especially if they're granting us money. But also making sure that we're forming meaningful policy. I don't want to just haphazardly say, we check that box and let's move on. If we're going to go through this whole process, I want to make sure that we have stuff that feels like it's right for us, it's actionable, it's doable, and it's going to work for our community. So as long as we get there, I'm fine with that. Okay. Anything else at this point for the good of the order? Anybody else have anything that they wanted to add? Okay. Yes, sir.
I don't know whether this is appropriate now or not, but Ryan, what come out at the RTC meeting on the other day when I was going out of the courthouse and you were headed in.
Well, you
This-
have an email waiting for you that's 2 pages long.
Yeah.
with the answers to that.
I was looking at my,
Ryan wrote us all an email.
okay, well then I missed that one today. I couldn't get it up on my, Julie fixed it for me when I got here. Okay.
Okay.
My answer's been, my question's been answered.
I just
Counselor
want to
Wells'
give
question's been
Counselor
answered.
Davis
Okay.
props for actually having written a very detailed response to
It
that
was.
question of what happened at the RTC meeting. He had a great debrief with all the detail associated with the meeting, so it's good stuff. Well worth the read.
Ironically, I read that during the time we had from our other council meetings from the federal government, so thanks. Okay, I think we're ready to move on then, it sounds like. Yeah. Okay.
I do not have anything else. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can move on from the climate planning portion of this study session and go to our next agenda item.
All right, thank you, Director Luss. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Marty, for all your work
Thank you all, yeah.
on this. Mayor and Council, we have one more item on your study session agenda this evening, and it is a very short but important from a timing perspective. We've been asked to evaluate, other small cities have asked us to evaluate a potential change in the structure of the EMS, Emergency Medical Services District 2 Board that is being it's being discussed right now, and there will be action that may occur next week prior to when I will see you again. So I did want to get some just rough guidance from you as to where you are on this. So first and foremost, just to describe what EMS District 2 is, the Clark County EMS District 2 is an area that covers the cities of Woodland, Ridgefield, La Center, Battleground, and unincorporated Western and Central Clark County. It's not an agency, has no employees. It's a governmental board whose sole purpose is to ensure emergency ambulance service is available within that service area. The EMS board currently is made up of 2 county councilors and a small cities representative. Former Mayor Onslow had served representing us on that board, representing all the small cities, but it rotates every 2 years currently. So 3 seats, 2 of them are county councilors, 1 of them is a small cities rep of all 4 of the cities that rotates. So that's the current structure of this. Now, what do we know about EMS2 board and why is their work important? Since 2015, EMS2's contract for ambulance service has piggybacked on the City of Vancouver's ambulance contract. After Vancouver awarded the current contract to AMR in 2015, it renewed it for another 5 years in 2020, so that brings us to 2025. And there's a whole bunch of detail in there about what they were required to do in that contract. As you may remember, we've talked about this before, that Vancouver decided that they were no longer interested in having that shared contract with Clark County and other cities, so they have moved toward doing their own contract. They have established that contractual relationship with AMR, and then they told the county, they told EMS District 2, if you'd like to, we'll allow you to piggyback on our contract for 2025, but no longer. But you can piggyback for 2025, but by the end of 2025, you need to have your own thing. So that is the process that the board is going through right now, is what does that look like? What does service delivery for ambulance service look like moving forward, taking Vancouver out of the equation, and how do you do it in a way that doesn't increase the cost of service for those who use ambulances and do it without a subsidy from local governments? Because that's one of the potential dangers that we see, is if a contract comes back from AMR and AMR raises the contract rates to a level that can't be absorbed through user fees, then there would be a need for a subsidy from all of those local jurisdictions. So there's a lot of conversation about how do we do it in a cost-effective manner. That's the EMS board, that's the work that they're doing right now. As part of that, because there is this expanded conversation of EMS District 2 actually doing more than just kind of managing a piggybacked contract with Vancouver, which really isn't much work at all. But they're actually looking at providing a whole new service delivery model. There's more importance in the board's work. So the EMS District 2 board has talked about wanting to expand their membership. So they're looking at going from 3 to 5 members. So from 3 to 5 members, and then instead of there being 2 county council and just 1 small city, actually what they're looking at is the potential for 2 from the county. I'm just making sure I have it right. Okay. So having what it most likely looks like is having 2 from the county. So you'd have the preliminary idea would be, since you have Battleground, Ridgefield, La Center, and Woodland, that you would have Battleground as the largest of the 4 and be on its own, and then Ridgefield, La Center, and Woodland would then share the other seat. That's the preliminary, is that, you know, what they're looking at on that. So instead of 4 rotating a seat as one of 3, it would be 3 cities that we would be a part of rotating as one of 5. So that is the first piece of this. And then the 5th seat, they're looking at maybe adding a fire district representative, because one of the service model, the service delivery models that we're looking at is having high priority calls. What we're doing like through the transition, which is CCFR actually has the ability to do transport now, and they are already doing priority 1 transport. And the idea would be, well, maybe that's something we expand to the entirety of the EMS District 2, is having fire districts provide that first highest level transport, and then, you know, 1s and 2s, and then lower level transport would go with AMR, where time is not as much of the essence with it. So that's a future question as far as how we do the service delivery. Right now, the question is, what do we think about expanding the board from 3 to 5, and what do we think of the idea of how those new seats go? Because that means 2 new seats, and one of those would be for fire district probably, or not. That's what they're seeking kind of guidance on. And then the other one would be an additional small city seat, and there's a specific configuration they're looking at. So I just kind of want to get some feedback for you on both of those questions. Number 1, what do you think about expanding the board? Number 2, what about the configuration, at least the preliminary configuration?
Okay, council, I guess we can go around, because I'm guessing there's going to be quite a few thoughts on this, or maybe there is. So we'll start at this end and we'll kind of work our way around.
My question is, was that, what happened to Yakult? I never heard you say anything about Yakult, but that's C-Tran and Ridgefield and La Center.
Yeah, that's C-Tran, not on on EMS District 2 board, they're not included.
Right, oh, they're not included.
No, I think they're North County, or, yeah, I think it's North County.
So,
yeah, they have their own.
So then, have we always been with Woodland and
Yes.
Woodland and La Center and Ridgefield?
Yeah, it's been, so up to this point, it has been a shared seat as one of 3 with Battleground, us, La Center, and Woodland as the small cities that are part of EMS District 2 and that have shared a single seat on that board.
So then we would still be a shared of 3 with Woodland potentially?
With Woodland and La Center, potentially.
Yeah.
That's the preliminary kind of concept.
Okay. I could see for expanding to 5. We'll go from there for somebody else for a comment.
I believe I too would be in favor of going to 5 and sharing with Woodland and the center, did you say? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm in favor of it, and I think why Woodland and Battleground, it's all the same. It's still Clark County Fire District, and then part of Battleground is District 3, and then so on. So it makes sense that we would expand as we grow, but also with this contract issue that I actually follow pretty, closely. So.
Others?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of expanding to 5, and I guess I see it from just a different definition of, it's expanding to 5 by giving Battleground its own seat that's unshared, and then creating another one for the fire district, leaving us still sharing. I guess my only little hesitation is when I look at our service needs compared to the service needs of the communities that we view sharing the seats with, I think there's a difference. And I think it's worth considering those differences.
How are they different?
I mean, for one, I think in many ways, well, for one, Woodland is shared with 2 different counties. So right?
Yeah.
Depends on how you look at it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most of Woodland is Cowlitz County.
Right.
And so-
But for some purposes, it's
Yeah.
all Cowlitz County, so they have to, yeah, it gets.
Yeah, if you think about CCFR,
Yeah.
so for the purposes of emergency
Yeah.
response, it's not as clean as the UGAs
Yeah.
are on this, because CCFR actually provides service for the city of Woodland as a whole.
Right.
And provides it for
Yeah.
them. So I think that's why they put us there.
Okay.
Is they said, okay, well, CCFR covers Ridgefield, La Center, Woodland, so they kind of put us together because functionally for AMR, for emergency response, and if CCFRs, if fire districts are going to be providing ambulatory service, I think that's why they did that.
Okay. Yeah,
Those services come south. They don't go north. So,
Yeah.
yeah, they come to the south to the hospital. Sorry. Those generally come south to the hospital. They don't
Yeah.
go north. So it's still feeding into this area.
I guess I'm just, what issue really kind of comes up first to me is we have areas of the city that are higher concentration than a lot of places like La Center. And so that's the big difference that popped out. And I guess originally I was thinking about the part of Woodland that is only in Clark County, and if that's an error, and that would change my calculus. But that's what originally led, because I'm like, the part of Woodland that's in Clark County is very small and very kind of rural, and with centers, it's different in terms of how much it's concentrated, whereas we are way more heavily concentrated. And so whether that's a difference or not, or that should be an impact over this, how the seat is.
So something to feed into this, and just kind of to your point on this, one of the things with the AMR contract that we had and are still piggybacking on, but the one that we had for years, one of the concerns that we had is the level of service that we got from AMR, because we were determined to be a rural jurisdiction. So our response time requirements, instead of it being urban or suburban, which I think urban was like 19 and suburban was like 23 or 24 minute, and that they had to hit, ours is like 29. And they were having problems even hitting that a lot of times. But so to your point, we certainly have been fighting for, and Chief Knorr's been clear on that, pushing towards saying, hey, we really think Ridgefield should get a different classification. Before this all blew up, they were pushing pretty hard to say AMR contract, and we were supportive of that. As staff, I was supportive of that move to increase our service level from AMR and move us into that suburban ring of response time. Now the question becomes, would you do the same for La Center? Would they be at that same level of urbanization to create that lower response time? And if we were sharing a seat with them, would that be represented? Would our kind of urbanization be represented? And so it's a good point, recognizing that difference. So it's in difference for service need. It might be a difference in service response time and urbanization and how we are categorized. So it may be something to kind of push back on a little bit as far as that piece of it.
I guess that's where my head was at with it is, it seems like we're coming up with an expanded board composition that is based exclusively on population, but not necessarily on need. So that urbanization element, I think, is different. I look at, say, Ridgefield versus, I can't say for certain, but it seems like to me that Ridgefield and La Center may have different needs in that area, and therefore those are perspectives I think that need to be simultaneously represented on the board. Does that make sense? Like I don't know if I like the idea of Battleground gets its own seat, but then Woodland, Ridgefield, and the Center each have to share a board seat, and those are 3 jurisdictions that have but maybe different needs that need to be represented in different ways. So, and the question I was going to ask about that though is, for board composition, is there a framework that we are obligated to work on, or is it, because I know that, like, it seems like a lot of RTC or C-Tran, has sort of a similar makeup, right? But like, I think of the mosquito control board. Every mosquito control board has one representative from every city, and so, like, why wouldn't we do it that way? Everyone gets their own seat, and then you maybe expand it to, say, 7 seats, where the county gets 2, each city gets their own, and then a fire service rep as well. Is that even an option to consider?
Well, and I want to step very cautiously in saying this is not what I want to advocate for, but I'm just throwing it out there, is what's the intent of the county having 2 of the seats?
That area would serve sorry.
Yeah.
When we go through with this contract, county has to have a seat because that would serve all the unincorporated Clark County areas, which is 2 is a large area. It's a huge area, so 2 does make sense geographically, the serving area.
Geographically, but does it make sense?
And population, because it's,
is that what we're saying?
yes, both, because the population served by EMS District 2 is like all of that area, like Orchards and Salmon Creek and Hazeldale and Philida. It's all that area.
That's all.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all of the urban unincorporated.
So as far as population, it really does, like,
There's
even
a reason it has been 3, with 2 of the 3 being the county.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Mr. Wells?
Has there ever been any discussion about 7 seats?
No, this is the first conversation about going anywhere from 3. And so, no, there hasn't been a discussion about going to 7. What I would anticipate is exactly what was stated, is that ultimately I cannot believe that the county would go from having 2/3 of the say on the EMS District 2 board to having 2/7 of the EMS District 2 board, because their population base is the vast majority of the population served, and they pay the most. So if I was on the county council, there is no way in God's green earth I would do that. Now, could we suggest it? Sure. I just don't think going in there with that as, like, we think it should be 7. We could say that, but I would certainly want to know what our backup plan was.
Mm-hmm. The reason for that is with our projected growth.
We're never going to get close to Orchards and Hazeldale and Salmon Creek.
No, not with the county. I just think the county should have turned around and have 2 seats. But with Ridgefield being 35,000 people down the road, that's where I think bringing up possibly 7 and planting a seat and see what happens 10 years from now.
I am happy to carry that message if that is something that you're kind of working toward.
Just for my own information, could somebody help me understand what is the benefit to Ridgefield to having our own representative? Does it provide us better service? What is the benefit?
The benefit for us to be included is right now we are still considered a very rural community. If you have AMR who's based in Vancouver and they're in the east side of Vancouver and they get a call for here in Ridgefield, it is a level 3, we'll say, which is somebody's having a panic attack. They need to go to the emergency room. They're requesting emergency services. It is going to take that ambulance to get from east side of Vancouver all the way to Ridgefield and all the intricacies that come into that. Then you have our fire district who is going to respond to that call because they're here, and then they have to determine, are they going to stay on scene until that ambulance gets there, which holds up our entire fire department until they get a secondary ambulance there so that this patient is taken care of.
With our own representative, that takes care of that.
It's not that it takes care of it, but it speaks to what we deal with here in other rural communities. And I think we have to be careful to say just because we have a seat at the table means that services are going to be better or we benefit from that somehow. But I think we look at it as population, but they look at it as rural pockets of community and how that's, you know, spread out. It's not like we have our Ridgefield Fire Department, so we get priority calls over everything. It is just how it's served in general, not just Ridgefield specifically, and how we can all work together and then give feedback to our fire departments that maybe we want to look at being a district that does their in-house transportation. Kelso Fire Department, they do their own, or they're moving towards doing their own transportation for all calls, not just priority calls. So there's so much more that feeds into it by having representation at the table.
Thank you for that. Thank you for clarifying on that. Absolutely agreed. And is the only other kind of wrinkle in this is, it was mentioned earlier, like C-Tran, RTC, kind of what we do with them. There is an interlocal, that's what we're discussing, is that it's an interlocal for EMS District 2 board and the board composition of that. So it is apropos in thinking about, like, all right, how do we structure these other interlocals? One of the things we might want to look at, like if the county, maybe we, certainly I'm willing to entertain, like, okay, we're growing quickly, so we really are concerned about us sharing a seat with two other jurisdictions which may have different service needs or service classifications from Ridgefield. And then I could even, certainly propose something similar to what we do at C-Tran, which is there are 3 jurisdictions that are shared, that share a seat, but we are, instead of every second year or every third year in this case, serving, the way we do it on C-Tran is because of the size of our jurisdiction. We say, well, every other year we are the person at the table. We're the group at the table. And first year we want to be that group because it's determining what the contract parameters are going to be. And it's the most important year. And then every other year we serve as the representative. And then when we're not, then we're the alternate. And then the other 2 smaller jurisdictions, they can switch it between them in the off year of who serves and kind of do it how we do with C-Tran. I certainly could use that as a model to better kind of capture what I'm hearing from council. But again, and talking to them about having to be more reflective of our growth and our population and service needs. Does that get to some of what you're speaking to, Councilor Wells?
Yeah, if we can get yes, it does. And I like that every other year where we're the alternate. So that still gives us a little more exposure to the seat with being the alternate, but we're off and on. So, yeah.
Okay.
Again, I just go back to, part of it is classification, part of it is need, part of it is population. How we approach that. Yes, I'd be open to that as a solution where, Ridgefield gets 1 seat and then the center and Ridgefield would rotate on the off year. And then, I still think that we're edging toward, if you look at what our population are, so like in 10 years, we will be the size that Battleground is now. And so then I wondered, does that mean that in 10 years, we are entitled to our own seat too, because we're based off of population? I would just want to make sure that we, whatever route we go, because what I've seen as far as other boards, RTC, C-Tran, those board compositions are pretty difficult to change. And I understand intentionally so, but I want to leave some flexibility because based off of growth and classification alone, I think we need to have the flexibility to revisit that so that, my interest in Ridgefield, I want to make sure that Ridgefield is represented, so I wish we had a seat the whole time. I understand maybe the reasons why now, but in the future, I think there's going to be a real case for that. So,
well, and if the contract is created this year, then if the contract needs to go into effect January 1st of 26, will probably be for 5 years, right? The other one has been. So this is the critical year. Is going to be these next few months, whoever is on this committee and works on this contract. So I think it definitely should be a 5-person committee at least. I think 3 people is too little, especially with 2 people from the county council that we, I think it should have 5 people.
And to their credit, the county council, Sue Marshall, who is serving as the chair of this board, actually was one of the people that reached out and suggested expanding and bringing in more voices to it. So to their credit.
Okay. Is there any will there be pending action like a resolution, or is it just, are you just looking for input and then you take that to the
Yeah,
the
just
board?
looking for input.
Okay.
We don't have a seat on that board right now, right? And so our seat is represented by the city of Battleground. Eric Overholser is the representative for small cities. So Councilor Overholser has been reaching out and saying, hey, what do you guys think about this? So just seeking input.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this, council?
Does he have contracting background? Is he a contracting person?
No idea.
Okay. No, I think everyone's good. Councilor Hamilton agrees with the 5-person board makeup. Okay. Okay, I think we're good. And with that,
Thank you, Mayor. I have what I need. Thank you for your work, Council.
okay, and with that, we'll wrap the study session. Thank you very much, council.
I would just like to say that I like this format for study sessions. I think it's a terrific, terrific idea.